I've stood near that gate for 11 years. 11. I sell nothing now, but back then I ran a little coffee stand just off the pavement, close enough that I could hear the guards' boots when they changed. And in all those years, watching thousands of faces come and go, I had never once seen a powerful man turn that pale that fast. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me slow down. Let me tell it the way it happened, because if I rush it, you won't believe me, and I need you to believe me. It was late September, one of those London mornings where the sky can't decide what it wants to be. Gray, then a little sun, then gray again. The air smelled of wet stone and diesel and somebody's cigarette 3 feet away. Cold enough that the tourists kept their hands in their coats, but not cold enough for gloves. You know the kind of day. The crowd that morning was thick. There'd been word going round that some foreign delegation was arriving. You always knew because the police presence would thicken up a day before, quiet men in dark coats standing where they usually didn't. And the barriers came out. Those low metal ones, they line up along the pavement. The tourists loved it, of course. More barriers meant something important, and something important meant photos. I remember a family from somewhere warm, Spain, maybe, or Italy. The mother trying to get her 2 kids to stand still for a picture, and neither of them wanting to. There was an old couple from the Midlands who'd clearly done this trip a dozen times, sipping tea from a flask, not even looking at the palace. And there were the phones, always the phones, a whole wall of little glowing rectangles held up over people's heads. And then there was the guard. Now, I'd seen this particular one before. I didn't know his name. You never do. That's part of it, isn't it? They're not men to you when they're on post. They're a red coat and a tall black bearskin and a rifle and a stare that goes straight through you like you're a pane of glass. But I'd noticed this one over the weeks because of a small thing. He had a way of standing that was somehow more still than the others. I can't explain it better than that. Some of the young lads, you could see them shift their weight now and then, blink a little too much, catch a pretty girl's eye in the crowd. Not him. He stood like he'd been carved and left there 100 years ago, like the pavement had grown up around his boots. That morning he was on the box, the little sentry platform near the gate. And the crowd was doing what crowds always do, testing him. There's always someone who wants to make a guard laugh, always someone who leans in too close, waves a hand in front of his face, pulls a stupid face of their own. A lad in a football shirt did the whole routine that morning. Jumping jacks, silly voices, his mates filming it, laughing. The guard didn't move a muscle, not one. And eventually the lad got bored, because that's how it goes. The guard always wins that game. Always, he wins it by doing nothing at all. I remember thinking that morning how strange a job it is, to stand there hour after hour while people who will never remember your face try their hardest to break you. And you just don't break. There's a kind of strength in that most people never even see. They think it's just standing. It isn't just standing. I've watched enough of them to know. Anyway, around 10 o'clock, maybe a little after, the delegation came. You heard it before you saw it, that low murmur that moves through a crowd when cars appear. Black cars, polished so hard they looked wet. A little motorcade of them, sliding up to the far side, and out came the men in their dark suits and their sharp coats, and among them, and you could tell at once he was the one who mattered, a man in uniform. A military uniform, not British, foreign, dark, immaculate, with a row of ribbon and metal on the chest that caught what little light there was. Even from where I stood, 40 feet off, you could see the shine on his shoes. You could see the way the others stepped a half pace behind him, the way people do around someone they're afraid of. He walked like a man used to the ground getting out of his way. I found out later who he was, a commander in the Chinese military, high up, very high up, the sort of man who, in his own country, could clear a room by walking into it. He was here as part of some official visit, trade, defense, ceremony, the kind of thing that gets a small paragraph in the paper and no photo. And that morning, part of his schedule brought him past the palace, past the gate, past our guard on his box. Now here's where I have to be careful, because what happened next was small. If you'd been there and you'd blinked, you might have missed the start of it. But I didn't blink. I've turned it over in my head so many times I could draw you a map of it. The commander stopped. He wasn't supposed to, I don't think. The others around him, his aides, the embassy men, a couple of our own officials guiding the visit, they kept moving for a step or two before they realized he'd halted. And they had to sort of shuffle back, all of them awkward, the way a line of ducks does when the front one changes its mind. He'd stopped in front of the guard. He was looking up at him, head tilted back a little because the guard on the box stood higher and the bearskin made him taller still. And the commander looked at him for a long moment, not the way tourists look, not with a phone up, not laughing, not wanting a photo. He looked at him the way one soldier looks at another, measuring him, reading him. And then he did something. He straightened up, squared his shoulders, and he gave the smallest nod, just a dip of the chin. It was the kind of gesture a man like that would consider a great honor to give. From him to a young British soldier standing in the cold, it was practically a medal. I understood that even then, even standing there with my hands going numb. That nod meant, I see you. I acknowledge you, soldier to soldier. Now you acknowledge me back. Because that's how it works, isn't it, in his world? Rank sees rank. You nod, the lower man nods deeper. You offer respect. Respect is returned, multiplied upward. That's the whole architecture of a man like that. His entire life had been built on it. Every room he'd ever walked into had rearranged itself around him. Every person he'd ever met had, in some way, bowed. He waited. The guard did not move. Not the eyes, not the chin, not a flicker. The guard stared straight ahead over the commander's head at some fixed point in the middle distance that he'd been trained to find and hold no matter what. The rifle stayed at his shoulder. The face stayed like stone. And I felt it in the air, that little shift. The crowd hadn't fully understood yet, but some of us had. Some of us felt the temperature change. The commander's expression didn't crack, not at first. He was too disciplined for that, but something moved behind his eyes. A recalculation, perhaps he thought the man hadn't seen. Perhaps he'd been too subtle, so he did it again, clearer this time, a firmer nod, more deliberate. And he said something. Low. In his own language, then, I think a word or two of English. I only caught the tone, not the words. But the tone was unmistakable. It was the tone of a man saying, I am speaking to you, you will respond. The guard did not respond. Now the aides were nervous. You could see it. One of the embassy men, a younger fellow, sharp suit, glasses, leaned in and murmured something to the commander, quick and quiet, and I could imagine exactly what it was. He was explaining. He was saying, sir, they don't, it's not, he can't, sir, it's the custom, they're not permitted to react, it's nothing personal, please, sir, we should keep moving. I've thought a lot about that young man in the glasses. What a job he had that morning, trying to explain to one of the most powerful men in his country that a 20-something British lad in a fancy hat was not going to nod back at him. And that it wasn't an insult, and that there was nothing anyone could do about it. The commander held up one hand, just slightly, enough to silence the aide. And that told me everything about the kind of man he was, because most people, when they're embarrassed in public, they retreat, they laugh it off, they move along. He didn't. He wasn't embarrassed. He was affronted. There's a difference, and it's a big one. Embarrassment wants the moment to end. Affront wants the moment to be corrected. He stepped closer to the box. Now the tourists had cottoned on. The phones, which had been drifting, all swung round. That little glowing wall reassembled itself, pointed at the commander and the guard. The lad in the football shirt had gone quiet. The Spanish mother had stopped worrying about her kids. Even the old couple with the tea flask had lowered their cups. Everyone could feel it now. That crackle, the sense that you were watching something you weren't meant to be watching. The commander looked up at the guard's face, really looked, searching it for a reaction, any reaction, and he found nothing. Absolutely nothing. And I watched this powerful man, this man the whole world stepped around, run headlong into something he could not move, could not command, could not buy, and could not frighten. He said something again, sharper, and this time I did catch one English word because he said it clearly, almost spitting it. Respect. That word hung in the cold air. Respect. He'd offered it, he'd demanded it. And this boy in the red coat had in his eyes refused it. And here's the thing that most of the crowd didn't understand, and I only half understood myself in that moment. The guard hadn't refused him anything. The guard wasn't ignoring him out of rudeness or pride. The guard was doing his duty. His duty was to stand, to not react, to be a wall. That stillness wasn't disrespect. It was the deepest kind of discipline there is. He would have stood exactly the same for a king or a beggar or a fly landing on his nose. That was the whole point. He belonged to no one man's expectations. He belonged to the post. But you couldn't explain that in a second, and the commander wasn't in a mood to hear it. His face had changed by now. That careful control was slipping. There was color rising in his neck. His jaw had set hard. And the men around him had gone very, very still, the way people do around a boss who's about to lose his temper, everyone frozen, no one wanting to be the one he turns on. And I stood there with my cold hands, watching, thinking, this is going to go wrong. Somebody's going to say something. Somebody's going to do something. This is going to be one of those little incidents that ends up on the news, a diplomatic embarrassment, a headline. I could feel it building like weather. What I didn't know, what none of us in that crowd knew, what even the commander and his nervous aides and our own quiet men in dark coats didn't know, was that in about 90 seconds, none of this would matter. None of it. Because a mile away, across the trees near the far edge of Hyde Park, something was about to happen that would strip everything down to what it really was. It would take this contest of pride between a foreign commander and a British boy, and it would answer it completely, terribly, and in a way not one of us could have imagined. But I'm getting ahead again. Let me stay with the moment. Let me stay in the cold with the phones up and the commander's face reddening and the guards staring at nothing, because that's where we all were when it started. Innocent, watching a small drama about pride, not knowing. The commander leaned in, close now, closer than anyone should to a man on post. Close enough that one of the police officers near the barrier took a half-step forward, hand drifting toward his own belt, watching. The commander's voice dropped, and though I couldn't hear the words, I could read the shape of it on his lips and in his eyes. He was giving the boy a last chance. In his mind, a generous one. Acknowledge me, nod, blink, anything. Give me one small thing and I will let this go. The guard gave him nothing. Not out of spite. I keep saying it because it matters. Out of duty. Out of 11 decades of tradition standing on the shoulders of that one young man's spine. He wasn't in a battle of egos. He didn't even see it as a battle. He was simply doing the one thing he was there to do. The thing he'd have done if the whole world had lined up to laugh at him, or shout at him, or beg him. He stood. And the commander straightened up slowly. And I saw on his face the beginning of a decision. A cold one, the look of a man who has just moved this from personal to official in his head. The look of a man thinking, fine, if the soldier will not honor me, I will take this to those who will answer for him. His eyes flicked to the embassy men, to our own officials. There'd be words later in rooms, over tables, complaints. This boy would be named maybe, reported. That's what that look meant. The aide in the glasses had gone gray. And that right then was the moment the sound came. I want to describe it properly because everyone who was there describes it differently, and I've decided that's because there's no proper word for it. It wasn't a bang, exactly. A bang is too clean. This was deeper. It came up through the pavement before it reached your ears, a thump you felt in your chest and your teeth, and then the noise arrived, huge and flat and wrong, rolling across the top of the buildings from the direction of the park. And for one full second, I swear it was a full second, nobody moved. The whole crowd, all those tourists, the family, the old couple, the aides, the police, the commander, every single one of us stood frozen, exactly like the guard, all of us stone for one heartbeat, our faces all turned the same way, toward the trees, toward the sound. And then the birds went up, hundreds of them off the rooftops and out of the park, a great dark scatter against the gray sky. And then the screaming started. Screaming is a strange thing when it comes all at once from a crowd. It doesn't sound like one big sound. It sounds like 100 small, separate sounds all colliding. A woman's sharp cry over here. A man shouting a name over there. A child, and I'll never forget this, a child laughing, actually laughing because he was too young to understand, and his laugh in the middle of all that fear was the worst part of it. For a moment I couldn't move. I want to be honest with you about that. People think in a crisis you either freeze or you run, but there's a third thing, and it's the thing that got me. You just stand there, your brain scrambling to catch up with your body, refusing to believe the ordinary morning has just ended. I was still holding a paper cup someone had left on my stand. I remember looking down at it like it was the strangest object in the world. The dark plume was rising over the trees now. You could see it from the gate. Gray-black, ugly, climbing fast and then flattening out and drifting. And the smell reached us after, that chemical, burnt, electrical smell that isn't like anything else, and that your body somehow knows to be afraid of even the first time you meet it. And then the crowd broke. I've seen a football crowd surge. I've seen the Boxing Day sales. I had never seen anything like this. It wasn't a direction, that was the terrible thing. People ran every way at once, toward the noise, away from the noise, in circles, into each other. The barriers went over. Those low metal ones just folded flat under the rush, clanging on the stone, and people tripped on them and went down, and other people ran over them or hauled them up. The Spanish mother, I saw her. She had one child by the wrist and was screaming for the other. Spinning, spinning. That awful panic of a parent who has lost sight of one of their two. The police were shouting now, trying to make a shape out of the chaos, arms out, moving people, and their voices had that high, hard edge that told you they were scared too, underneath the training. Radios crackling. Someone was already running toward the park, against the flow, 3 officers, coats flying. And I looked because some part of me needed to look, needed an anchor. I looked at the box, at the guard. He was still there. He hadn't moved. In all of it, the blast, the birds, the screaming, the stampede coming apart around his feet, he stood on his box, rifle at his shoulder, eyes forward. Stone. And I know how that sounds. I know you might think, well, that's just shock, that's just a man too stunned to react. But it wasn't. I was close enough to see his eyes, and there was no blankness in them. They were sharp. Alert. Moving just slightly, tracking, reading the crowd, reading the smoke, reading the situation, while the rest of him stayed absolutely locked to his post. That's when I understood something about that stillness that I'd never understood in 11 years of watching them. It wasn't emptiness. It was the opposite. It was a man holding himself with everything he had so that in the middle of a world coming apart there was one fixed point. One thing that had not moved. And I swear to you, people felt it. In the chaos, I watched 2 or 3 of the tourists, the panicking ones, instinctively drift toward him, toward the still thing. The way you grab the one post that isn't shaking. And the commander was still there too. His aides were pulling at him now, you could see it. The young man in the glasses had a hand on his arm, the embassy men were closing around him, and there was a car being brought up fast, an official vehicle, doors open, the whole protective machine of important men swinging into action to get their VIP out of danger. That's the protocol. When something goes bang, you get the principal to the car, you get him gone. They were doing exactly what they were trained to do. But the commander wasn't going. He turned toward the smoke, and his face had completely changed from what it was a minute ago. The affront, the wounded pride, the whole business about the nod and the respect, it was gone off him like it had never existed. What was there now was something older and harder. A soldier's face. He knew that sound. A man like him in a life like his, he'd heard that sound before in places most of us only see on the news. He knew exactly what it was. And every instinct in him was reading the situation the way the guard was reading it, the smoke, the crowd, the danger, the exits. The aides were pulling. He shrugged them off. Once hard, and he stood his ground and looked at the park, and I remember thinking, in the middle of everything, these 2 men. This foreign commander and this British boy. 90 seconds ago, they were locked in a silly contest of pride, and now, without a word, without so much as looking at each other, they were the only 2 people in that whole square who weren't running. Both of them turned toward the danger instead of away from it. Both of them still. Maybe that's when the commander first understood. I don't know. I like to think it was. And then the second thing happened. The thing that no one talks about when they talk about that day, because the bomb was the big story, but for me it was this. There was a woman. She'd been near the gate, close to the box, when the crowd broke. Older. 60s, maybe. I'd noticed her earlier before any of it because she'd been standing on her own, quite happily, taking her time over the palace with an old-fashioned camera, the kind with a strap, no phone. When the surge came, she'd been knocked. Gone down. And now she was on the ground, right at the base of the barriers by the box, and the crowd was pouring over and around her, and she couldn't get up. She had her arms over her head. People were stepping on her hands. I saw it. Nobody stopping, not because they were cruel, but because they were terrified, and a terrified crowd doesn't see the ground, it only sees the way out. She was going to be trampled. It's an ugly thing to say, but it's the plain truth. In another 10 seconds, in that press of bodies, she would have been badly hurt, maybe worse. She was small, and she was down, and the crowd was a river. I started to move toward her. I want that on the record, small as it is, I did start to move. But I was 40 feet off with an overturned stand between us and a wall of panicking people in the way. And I was too slow. And I knew I was too slow even as my legs started, and my stomach dropped because I understood I wasn't going to reach her in time. I didn't have to. The guard moved. He came off the box. In one motion. And this is the part where people don't believe me, and I don't blame them because I've stood in that square for 11 years and I know what those men do and what they don't do, and coming off the post in the middle of a duty is not. It does not happen. It is the thing they do not do. They stand. That's the whole covenant of it. Whatever happens in front of them, they stand. He came off the box. He crossed to her 3-4 strides fast, that heavy uniform and the rifle and all, and he did not hesitate at the edge of that crowd. He went into it. And a man in that uniform going into a crowd is like a plow going into a field. People got out of the way. Some of it was the uniform, some of it was just the sheer certainty of him, this figure that everyone in the world recognizes, moving with total purpose into the exact place everyone else was fleeing. He got to her, he got down, one knee on the cold stone, and he put himself between her body and the crowd. Turned his own back and shoulder into the oncoming press, took the shoving on himself, made a wall of himself over her the same way he'd been a wall on the box a minute before. Same discipline, different shape. And he got an arm under her and he lifted her, not gently exactly. There wasn't time for gentle, but sure, completely sure. And he brought her up and back out of the flow into the lee of the box where the barrier still gave a bit of shelter. I was close enough by then to hear him. First words I ever heard that guard speak, in 11 years of watching him and his fellows stand silent through every insult and camera and fool. And do you know what he said? He said, "I've got you. You're all right, I've got you." That's all quiet, steady, the way you'd talk to a frightened animal or a child. "I've got you." And the woman, she was shaking. She had a cut on her hand and her camera was smashed on the ground somewhere and she'd lost a shoe. She looked up at this red coat and this great black bearskin leaning over her, this thing she'd traveled to London to photograph now holding her up out of the crush, and she just grabbed a fistful of his sleeve and held on. Held on like it was the only solid thing left in the world. And maybe it was. Now, here's what I need you to see, because it's the whole hinge of everything. The commander saw it. He was still standing there, his aides frantic around him, the car door open and waiting, the smoke climbing, and he had turned back for 1 second and he saw it. He saw the guard come off the post. He saw the boy go into the crowd. He saw him put his own body between a stranger and the stampede. He saw him lift her and shelter her and speak to her. And I was watching the commander's face when he saw it, because by then I'd forgotten my own fear. I'd stopped moving. I was just standing in the middle of the chaos, staring at these people the way you stare when your brain has decided this is the thing that matters. Remember this. And I watched something happen to that man's face that I have never been able to properly describe. Everything that had been in it before, the pride, the demand, the affront, the cold official decision to have this boy reported, all of it just drained, emptied out. And what came into its place was something I can only call recognition. Like a man who thought he was looking at a wall and suddenly realizes he's looking at a door. His mouth actually opened a little. This commander, this man who cleared rooms, who had the whole world step around him, who 90 seconds earlier had spat the word respect at a boy for the crime of standing still. He stood there in the smoke and watched that same boy break the one rule of his entire post, throw away his precious discipline in a single heartbeat, not for a king, not for a commander, not for anyone who could reward him, but for a nobody. An old woman on the ground, a stranger who could give him nothing. And I saw the commander understand what respect actually was. I saw it land on him like the blast wave had. Because he'd wanted a nod. He'd wanted the boy to bow to rank, to power, to the medal on his own chest. And the boy had refused, and the commander had thought it was disrespect. And now, in the worst minute of an ordinary morning, the boy had shown him exactly what he was made of, and it turned out the thing the boy would break for wasn't power at all. It was the opposite of power. It was the smallest, weakest, most nobody person in the whole square. The commander didn't move. His aides pulled at him again, "Sir, please, the car, sir," and this time he let them steer him a step. But he didn't take his eyes off the guard and the woman. He watched. He watched the boy get her settled, watched him check her hand, watched him look up and around, scanning, already thinking about who else, what next, where's the danger, because it wasn't over. Not by a long way. Because that first blast near the park, that was the one everyone heard. That was the one that broke the morning. But there was a reason the police were shouting the way they were. There was a reason 3 of them had run toward the smoke and the rest were spreading out and pushing people back away from the buildings, away from the bins, away from the parked cars. There was a reason a hard-faced officer near the gate was into his radio, urgent, repeating something, his eyes going up and down the road. Because a bomb in a city is rarely just one bomb. And this one wasn't. The guard, still crouched by the old woman, went very still, that trained stillness again, but sharp now, listening. And I saw him turn his head just slightly toward the road, toward a spot maybe 30 feet from where we all were. A spot where the crowd was still thick, still spilling, still panicking. A spot near an abandoned bag that someone in the first surge had dropped and left, and that no one in all that chaos had thought to look at twice. I saw the guard look at that bag. And I saw his face change. And that's where I have to stop for a moment, because my hands are shaking a little even now, telling it. What that boy did next is the reason any of us are here to talk about it. It's the reason that old woman got to go home. It's the reason that laughing child kept laughing. And it's the reason that a Chinese commander, one of the most powerful men in the world, would stand in an embassy days later and be unable to speak. I've asked myself 100 times how he knew. The guard. How in all that noise and smoke and running, with a frightened woman clinging to his sleeve, he picked that one bag out of a whole square full of dropped things, because there were dropped things everywhere by then. Bags, coats, a pushchair on its side, shoes, God, the shoes. People always lose their shoes in a stampede, did you know that? The ground was covered in them. But he saw that bag. I think, and this is only me thinking, a man who sold coffee, so take it for what it's worth. I think it was because that bag was wrong. Everything else on the ground had been dropped mid-run, flung, scattered, the way panic scatters things. That bag was standing up, neat, set down, on its base upright against the foot of a lamp post in a spot where the crowd was thick, placed, not dropped. A thing that had been put there carefully by someone, and then that someone was gone. He saw it, and I watched the knowledge go across his face like a cloud shadow across a field. And here's what he did, and I need to tell it slowly because it happened fast and it deserves slow. He didn't shout bomb. I've thought about that a lot. If he'd shouted that word into that crowd, in the state that crowd was in, people would have gone mad. There'd have been a second stampede worse than the first, straight over each other, and toward, not away, because a panicking crowd doesn't run smart. It just runs. He knew that. Somehow, in a fraction of a second, that boy did the arithmetic and knew that the worst thing he could do was tell the truth loudly. So instead he stood up, fast, and he became again the thing he'd been trained to be, a wall, a certainty, a fixed point, except now he used it. He put his body between the crowd and the bag, and he started moving people, not gently. There wasn't time. He got his arms out and he pushed, herded, drove them back into the side, away from the lamp post. And he used that voice again, the one I'd heard for the first time a minute ago, but louder now, hard and flat and absolutely without panic. Move back. This way. Keep moving. Move back, please, this way, keep going. And people did. That's the thing, people obeyed him. In all that chaos, when they wouldn't have listened to a policeman with a whistle, they parted for that red coat. Because he wasn't afraid. Or if he was, he'd folded it away so completely that not a scrap of it showed, and a crowd will follow the one person who isn't afraid the way iron follows a magnet. He moved that whole section of the square, 30, 40 people, maybe more, back and around and away from that lamp post, in about the time it takes to tell it. And he did it without ever once saying the word that would have killed them all. The police caught on. One of the officers, the hard-faced one at the gate, saw what the guard was doing and understood it instantly, professional to professional, and started doing the same from the other side. And then there were more of them, and radios, and that clipped urgent code they use, and the whole machine turned, and the crowd got pushed back, into the wide open where nothing could hurt them. And I looked for the commander. He hadn't gone. His aides had almost got him into the car by then, 1 foot in practically, and he'd stopped again, half in and half out of that black official vehicle, watching. And what I saw next I would not have believed if I hadn't been looking straight at it. He got out of the car. He got out of the safe car, this man they were desperate to save, and he came back a few steps and he started helping. He didn't touch the bag, even he wasn't fool enough for that, and anyway the guard's whole body language was screaming stay away from it. But he turned, and with that natural authority he'd been born with and drilled into for 40 years, he started moving his own people, the embassy men, the officials, the stragglers, back and clear, adding his weight to what the guard was doing. 2 soldiers, one in red, one in dark, neither of them running, both of them, without a word between them, doing the same thing, getting everyone else out of the way of the danger, and putting themselves nearest to it. And then the bomb squad came, and the vans, and the whole professional apparatus of a city that has, God help it, done this before. And they cleared us all right back, past the far barriers, into the road, and I lost sight of the box and the lamp post in the bag. They found it was real. I'll tell you that plainly so you're not left hanging. The bag was real. There was a device in it. The people who know these things said afterward that it was in among that crowd, upright live, and that if it had gone off where it stood, with the number of people who'd been packed around it in those first panicked seconds, I'll not put a number on it. I don't want to. But it would have been the worst day this city had seen in a long, long time. They made it safe. Because a 20-something boy in a fancy hat, whose one job was to stand still, had seen a bag standing upright and known, in his bones, that it was wrong, and had moved a crowd off it without ever letting them feel the fear that would have finished them. The first blast near the park, that was the one that made all the noise. It hurt people. I won't pretend it didn't. Some were hurt and one didn't make it, and I think of that, and I'm not going to tidy it away to make my story neat. But it could have been so much more. The park device was, they think, meant to do exactly what it did: break the morning, panic the crowd, drive a river of frightened people straight over the second device by the palace. That was the trap. The first bang was the bait. The crowd was supposed to run itself onto the second one. And it would have. It was running that way, right up until a boy came off his post. Now, the end of it. And this is the part I've been wanting to tell you since I started, the part that stayed with me longest, longer even than the smoke and the screaming. Days later, there was a thing at the embassy. Not the Chinese one, ours, or theirs, I've never quite been sure. Some official room where the visit that had been so badly interrupted was somehow patched back together and finished. And by then the story had got round, quietly, the way these things do. The guard's name had come out. Not to the papers so much. They never make a fuss of these lads the way they should, but among the people who'd been there, and the officials, and the men in dark coats. Everyone knew what the boy had done. And the commander asked to see him. I heard about this from one of the officials afterward, a decent man who used to buy his coffee off me and who told me because he knew I'd been there and he knew I'd want to know. So it's secondhand, this last bit, and I'll flag that honestly. But he was in the room and I trust him, and I'll tell it the way he told me. The guard was brought in. Off duty now, so he was just a young man, out of the red coat and the bearskin in an ordinary uniform, ordinary size after all, no bigger than anyone, a bit nervous the way a young soldier is in a room full of important people. And the commander was there in all his medals, with all his aides, and the two of them stood facing each other. The same two men from the gate, except this time everything was the other way round. Because at the gate the commander had offered the boy a nod and demanded one back, and the boy had refused him, or seemed to. And now in that room the commander looked at the young man for a long moment, that same measuring look, soldier reading soldier. And then the commander bowed. Not a nod, not the small dip of the chin he'd offered at the gate as a great condescending honor. A bow. A full one from the waist deep, the kind a man like that gives perhaps 2 or 3 times in his whole life to perhaps 2 or 3 people. He held it. And the whole room went silent, the aides, the officials, everyone, because nobody there had ever seen the commander bow to anyone, and here he was, bent at the waist before a boy who a week ago he'd wanted to have reported for insolence. And when he straightened up, my friend said, he tried to speak, and he couldn't. This is the man from the story's title, and I've been building to him this whole time, so let me be plain. They left the embassy speechless, but the truth is it was him. It was the commander. He opened his mouth to say something to the boy, some thanks, some acknowledgement, some words worthy of the moment, and nothing came. His voice failed him. This man who had commanded thousands, who had given orders that moved armies, who had walked into 100 rooms and rearranged them by walking in, stood in front of one quiet young soldier and could not find a single word. His eyes filled. He put his hand over his mouth. And the whole room, all those powerful people, sat in a silence so complete you could have heard a pin drop, watching one of the most formidable men any of them had ever met be undone, completely, by the simple fact of what that boy had done. Because here's what had happened to him, I think. At the gate, he'd asked the boy for respect, and he'd meant, honor my rank, honor my power, honor the medal on my chest and the men behind me and everything I am. And the boy had stood still and given him nothing, and the commander had thought himself insulted. And then he'd watched that same boy throw everything away, his post, his rules, the one covenant of his whole duty, not for rank, not for power, not for anything that could ever repay him, but for an old woman on the ground who could give him nothing at all, and then move a crowd off a bomb without letting them feel their own fear. And the commander had understood, finally, standing in the smoke, that he had spent his entire life demanding a kind of respect that this boy had never once needed to demand, because the boy simply was the thing the commander had only ever performed. That's what took his voice, not gratitude exactly, something bigger and worse than gratitude. The understanding that the smallest man in the square had turned out to be the largest, and that all his medals and all his rank had been, next to what that boy did on one knee on cold stone, nothing much at all. The boy, by the way, my friend said he just stood there through all of it, uncomfortable, going a bit red, wishing he was anywhere else, the way these lads do when you try to thank them. And when it was finally over, when the commander had got some words out at last, broken ones, and it was done, they asked the boy if he wanted to say anything. And he said one thing, quiet, the same steady quiet I'd heard him use on the old woman by the box. He said, "I was just doing my job, sir." That's all, and then he asked, respectfully, if he might be dismissed, because he was due back on duty. Back on duty after all that? He wanted to go back and stand on the box. I've turned that over more than anything else in the whole story. This boy who'd done a thing generals write books about, and all he wanted was to get back to standing still in the cold while tourists pulled faces at him. But I understand it now better than I did, because that's the whole thing, isn't it? That's what the commander finally saw. The standing still and the running toward the bomb were never two different things. They were the same thing, the same man. He stood still on the box because his duty was to stand still. And he ran to the woman and he moved the crowd off the device because his duty underneath the red coat and the rules was always to protect. The stillness was never the opposite of action. It was action held, waiting until the moment it was needed. And when the moment came, it was there, complete, without hesitation, because it had been there the whole time. We just couldn't see it. The commander flew home a few days after. I never saw him again, obviously. But the official who told me all this said that on his way out at the very end of the visit, he'd asked for one thing to be passed along to the boy. A message. And it was short, and I've kept it in my head word for word because when I heard it, I had to put my cup down. He said to tell the young soldier, "For 50 years I taught men what respect looks like. Your grandson will not need teaching. He can be told. It looks like a boy who would not bow to me and then knelt for a stranger." I stood at that gate for 11 years. I sold coffee to 1,000 mornings. And that boy is back on his box today, right now, as I tell you this, standing still, staring straight ahead, while some lad in a football shirt does jumping jacks in his face and thinks he's the first person clever enough to try it. Go and look at him if you're ever passing. Really look, not for the photo, just look. Because the strongest man I ever saw wasn't the one covered in medals, who could clear a room by walking in. It was the one who stood so still you'd swear he was made of stone, right up until the second somebody needed him not to be.